let's go ahead and get started with this webinar. So in this particular Morpheus Tech Brief, we're going to cover custom instance UI tabs. So my name is Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. So before we jump into the custom tabs, we'll take a very brief look at the Morpheus platform itself. Really focuses on providing value in a couple of key areas from an IT operations standpoint. So workload lifecycle management, so being able to facilitate the automated end-to-end provisioning of workloads, whether it's on-prem or public cloud, also be able to perform day 2 or day in operations against those workloads. And finally, the last phase of decommissioning. In addition to that, being able to execute automation and orchestration from the platform, utilizing tools like Ansible, Chef, Puppet, PowerShell scripts, Bash scripts, in the context of workloads on demand, scheduled, as well as in a self-service fashion. And finally, the platform brings capability of cost management to both on-prem as well as public clouds in a proactive fashion, utilizing things like policy and governance, but also from a visibility standpoint to provide insights into the spin from a cloud perspective. So now let's jump into Morpheus custom UI tabs. So the Morpheus platform includes a plugin architecture or framework that enables the platform to be extended beyond what's capable out of the box with the Morpheus platform. And so one of those particular ways to extend the platform is via what we term as custom UI tabs. And so if we take a look at tabs within the Morpheus platform itself, so in this particular case, we have a virtual machine within our Morpheus platform that we've deployed, and now we have various tabs when we double click on the instance itself. And so a number of the tabs we see here are summary, deploy, storage, network, logs, backups, so forth and so on. And so ideally, in this case, we'd be able to add an additional tab, which would be a custom tab that might bring in contextual data from a third-party API endpoint or somewhere else within a given environment to be able to facilitate certain operations from a capability standpoint. And so that's what the custom tabs enable us to do, is to add extensibility from the standpoint of the platform, in which we could integrate with, let's say, a monitoring platform or a logging platform or a CMDB or whatever it might be to bring that contextual data into the Morpheus UI. And so example that we're going to walk through on today is a custom tab. In this particular case, it is utilizing HashiCorp console as an example. And so from a UI perspective, one of the things we see here is that it has been added to the tabs for the instances and is named HashiCorp console. We have some basic data that we're pulling back from the actual HashiCorp platform itself. So from a context standpoint, those that are unaware, HashiCorp console is a key value store, but also is a service mesh from a integration standpoint with workloads both in VMware or in virtual machines or instances, bare metal, as well as within Kubernetes. So in this particular case, we're pulling back some of the data from a service discovery standpoint. So being able to utilize it in a fashion similar to if you think about DNS servers. So in this case, we're pulling back some information about the services, about the particular data center in the context of console, as well as some metadata or services. As I mentioned, this is an example. Really what it's focused on is showcasing ways in which to integrate or connect with API endpoints, which is a common use case from a custom tab perspective. So in this case, we want to integrate with the HashiCorp console API endpoint to actually provide that visibility and insight into what's going on there. And so as we delve into the composition of this particular tab, one of the things that we see from a Morpheus standpoint is that it is actually generated utilizing CSS, HTML, JavaScript as options for rendering what the visual aspects that we see here, as well as utilizing Groovy code to facilitate the interaction with, in this particular case, the API endpoint to actually pull back that information from the REST API endpoint, and then finally use that to generate the presentation of the template to the end consumer. And so as we step through the process, similar to various other examples, in this particular case, HashiCorp console utilizes an agent on the actual workload or instance itself. And so similar to whether it is a monitoring agent or a logging agent or various other integrations So what we would do here is being able to reach out, in this case, to HashiCorp console. In this case, we're actually utilizing 2 API calls to pull back data about this specific instance within the Morpheus platform. And so as we see here on this diagram, Morpheus, the platform, is going to reach out to HashiCorp console via the REST API. So as I mentioned, it could be any other platform, any other system from an API standpoint, and then we'll actually be able to utilize it to information about the instance. In this case, we're going to pass to HashiCorp console to actually facilitate the integration point to perform the filtering or the actual polling of that data based upon or for that particular instance. And so that's the overall architecture. And so we're going to jump into the development process of a plugin itself. And so in this example, I'm going to be utilizing Visual Studio Code. Could be any various IDE, or if you so choose, you could go to utilize just a simple text editor. So in this particular case, what I want to do is actually open a folder within this particular context. So let me find the folder that I want. So I've already created a folder for this particular example. Let me find it. All right, let me do a quick find of what folder I created it. All right, Morpheus plugin console demo. PWD. So that's the problem. So I'll actually create a new folder. So in this particular case, we're going to create a folder to actually store our code, which now shows up for me. All right, and so one of the things I really like about Visual Studio Code in this particular case is that I'm going to actually utilize what's known as a remote container to actually craft and create or actually to be utilized to build the plugin itself. Certainly doesn't have to be the case. The reason I'm doing it is because I do not want to install the dependencies on my local system, which are Java as well as Gradle. And so in this case, I'm utilizing the ability to run it inside of a container to actually facilitate the generation of my jar file that we'll see. So in this case, I'm actually creating what's known as a dev container, simply using the Gradle. One of the things I also do is create a new file. Let's see, to actually host the workspace to enable me to run it inside the container. Workspace. So I'm going to open the workspace. That would be after I've provided the path. All right, so really all I'm doing is creating a way for me to actually run this inside of a container. So that way, when I go to actually build my jar file or my plugin, it will be captured within the actual plugin itself. So one of the first things I'll do is create a build.gradle file. It includes a number of settings, but in particular, so in this case, I'll copy and paste. There's a number of references on developer.morpheusdata.com to what this file would be like. In addition to that, there's also a number of examples in the Morpheus data documentation. And so I won't go through every specific detail, but I'll point out some various aspects for configuration for this particular plugin. So group being one that's often changed or modified, the reverse DNS typically for your organization. So in this case, I'm using com.morpheusdata, the version of the plugin that I want to generate. So in this case, I'm going to just leave it as 1.0.0. Utilize semantic versioning. The other thing would be is the plugin API version. So Morpheus, as I mentioned, has a plugin framework, and that includes an API from a integration standpoint, so there's a number of things that are updated and developed as part of that interface with the Morpheus platform. And so there's various versions of the plugin API that can be utilized that typically align to a specific version of the Morpheus platform. In this case, I'm going to utilize 0.12.3. There are oftentimes new features from a plugin standpoint that are released in newer versions that you may want to be able to leverage or utilize, but certainly realize that that often requires the need to upgrade the Morpheus platform in order to be able to support that capability, that functionality. And then finally, the last thing we'll take a look at here is the plugin class, which in this case is our reference to COM, Morpheus data, console, in this case, console integration, to provide the path for our plugin in this particular case, so to speak. So we have the group com morpheusdata.com or com.morpheusdata, which maps to what we saw as the group. And in this case, we're utilizing just a generic console and then console integration plugin as the name of our plugin. So one of the other things we'll do is create a Gradle.properties file that could be utilized as reference for various variables that we have to extract those out from our build.gradle. And so we can have various reference points in our Gradle.properties that could be utilized to replace specific versions in the build.gradle, and then just externalized to the Gradle.properties. All right, so we have just about everything we need right now from a overall structure standpoint from our broad plugin standpoint. So now we'll delve into specifics of the plugin itself. So what we'll do is we will create our directory structure. So source or SRC. Then we want to do main. So SRC main Groovy. So what this is going to start to do is allow us to actually create the plugin itself. And so with the plugin, there are actually a couple of components. So in this case, we're going to create a plugin which can contain multiple providers. In this particular context, what we want is a UI tab provider for a particular instance. So a plugin can have multiple providers, but in this case, there's going to be simply a one-to-one mapping from our plugin to our provider, as there's only going to be one provider for this particular plugin. And so Groovy, and this is where we get into needing to reference what we specified for our group in the build.gradle. In this particular example, it's com. So I'll expand this out for visibility. And then what we want is Morpheus data. So com Morpheus data. And then what we'll do here is we'll add new folder, console. So the reason we're adding that is, as we saw in our build.gradle, we had com, Morpheus data, and then console. And then now what we want to do is we want to get into the specifics of our actual plugin itself. So what we'll do is create a new file that is referred to as, in this case, we want console integration plugin.groovy. So this is going to be the entry point into our particular plugin that provides us the ability to interface with allows Morpheus to interface with the plugin itself. And so that maps to what we specified here, which was console integration plugin. So console integration plugin.groovy. So there's a couple of things with the plugin itself. So the first thing we'll specify is the package com.morpheus data.console. And so that maps to what we specified as part of in the build.gradle file. We're going to import a number of items from the Morpheus data plugin API. So the general plugin itself, permissions, which map to RBAC permissions within the Morpheus platform, handlebars renderer. So that's what we're going to actually utilize to render the HTML within the UI tab, view model, and then option type, or a number of things that we'll take a look at as well. So option type allows us, similar to inputs, or what were previously known as option types within the platform, similar to that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull in some chunks of code that I've got. So class console integration. So this maps to, in this case, what we specified as the file name, but also what we specified for the plugin class from what we specified in our build.gradle file. So we'll map those two together. So that's where why we specified console integration plugin, and why also our file was named that. So in this case, it extends the plugin capability. Pulling in another chunk of code, we've got git code, in this case, for the particular plugin itself. So it's going to be utilized as the code for our plugin from a Morpheus context standpoint. And then we're going to pull in the way to initialize our particular plugin. So we have a couple of things here to note. So we have initialize as the particular entry point. And so let me close this down so we can get better visibility of what's going on here. So a couple of things here. So we're adding a new console tab provider. And so we'll actually create the tab provider in a minute, but that's what we're going to use as the provider input. And so we're going to reference the console tab provider, which is what we're going to create. And then for this, so this is referring to the plugin. The plugin providers for this plugin, and we're going to add the console tab provider to this particular plugin. So that's the way we're injecting essentially the provider into the plugin. We're going to specify the name for the plugin. In this case, we're going with console integration plugin. The permissions for the particular plugin. So this is when we talk about the role-based access control for our particular plugin. We have a couple of options. In this case, we have none and full. There is also the ability to add a read permission for, let's say, there are certain actions where you want to have a user as with only read permissions to a particular tab that may have some actions within it. You may want to essentially turn those on and off based upon the level of permission they have, but not full visibility in terms of control at none or full. In this case, it's going to be just the visibility that we would control. So if the user has none, they don't see the tab. If the user has full, they would see the tab. And then so finally, the other thing that we have here is what would be a plugin setting, or the option type that's being specified. And so this shows up when we actually configure the plugin to show in this case, our example is the URL, specifying the URL for console. This could be a number of things that we would specify from, in this case, we don't have authentication. If there were authentication, we need to specify username and a password or some additional metadata for the administrator or user to specify essentially on the fly, then this is where it would take place. And so a number of things very similar to inputs or option types that are created within the Morpheus platform. So being able to specify things like the name, the code, the field name, display order, field label, help text. For those that have gone through the inputs or option types within the Morpheus platform, they look very familiar from a metadata or argument standpoint. So the last thing we'll do is we'll bring in one last chunk of code. So as I'm going through, feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A if there's something that we can get a little more clarity on, or just go a little bit deeper. All right, and the last thing we have is an on destroy. In this particular case, it is empty. So there's nothing for us to destroy or nothing, no action to take from a plugin removal standpoint. All right, so at this point, we have our plugin component or plugin class. And so now what we want to do is add our provider. So as I mentioned, provider maps to a plugin. And so what we want to do is we want to add a provider in this case. All right, let's see. So we're going to pull in another chunk of code. But what we want is a console tab provider. New file, console tab provider. Got groovy is what we want to name it. Let's move it under the console folder. So that is there. All right, so we're importing a couple of things. So like the provider, more context, once again, the plugin, account information or details, instance, references to instance, tag config, content security policy, user, a number of things that will actually leverage. And these can be found in the plugin API documentation. So if you go to developer.morpheusdata.com, there's a plugin API section that details these various classes along with their methods. All right, so I'm going to want to do is be able to utilize, so bringing in the logging library, console tab provider is the name of our class. It extends the abstract instance tab provider. A couple of things we're doing here in terms of setting essentially the table for our particular provider. So as far as utilizing the plugin capability, the context from a Morpheus standpoint, as well as bringing in the REST API util. So the Morpheus platform, or the plugin API, includes a helpful helper that can be utilized to make API calls that is more high level than utilizing the lower level libraries to make those API calls. All right, so let's drop that down. So we have a couple of things here. So being able to specify essentially references to what we specified up here, but also utilizing the REST API utility. In this case, we're calling it console API, just for ease of visibility. So a couple of sections in terms of what we want to be able to do. So now we've got the provider set up and ready to go. Now what we want to do is we want to get to the point of where we're starting to, as soon as rendering the template. So pasting in another code chunk here, and we'll go through it. So render the template. One of the things that's passed to this particular template is the instance. So information about the instance, I can utilize information about the instance as part of the rendering process. One of the things I want to do is get some additional information, in this case about the instance. And so that's where this task config is, or the build instance config. So to get some additional metadata that's not exposed natively via the instance reference that's passed into it. And so I'll use that to get some additional information about the instance for making decisions. And so now we've got the beginning of a try statement. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to reference the plugin settings. So in this case, we had the console server URL for our plugin settings in our plugin. So I'll bring in the code block and then I reference what I'm talking about. So in the console integration, the plugin part, we had this URL, which is going to be exposed in the Morpheus UI when you click on the particular plugin itself, and you'll see that the UI component shows up. And so to specify the particular server URL to specify. So in this case, I want to actually be able to grab that data. And so from the plugin, I want to get the settings. So in this case, I'm passing it to a settings variable. And then what I'm going to do is actually pull that out. I'm utilizing this block of code that actually is utilized to pull the data from the format in which it's presented, utilizing RxJava. And so once I've got the settings, so I'll add drop in this comment. So retrieve the plugin settings. That's what we're going to do first. And so this, as I mentioned, this could be a URL, like API endpoint, could be username, password, various settings that are passed to interact, in this case, with the API endpoint as part of the process. And so now what I want to do is I've got the payload. And so in this particular case, the payload is returned as a JSON object. And so the URL that we want for our console server is in the JSON payload. So now we need to parse the JSON payload. So that's what this code block is. So I'm utilizing the JSON slurper. It's going to parse the text from our settings output, which is where the actual payload was passed to. And then finally, I'm going to create a new map to start containing some information and some data as part of the process. So one of the things that we saw on our particular example was that we wanted to specify the name. So in this case, I'm grabbing the name just simply from the instance information that's passed into this particular provider. And then what we see here is we're making the API calls. And so if we take a look at the API calls that we need to make, we're going to make 2 API calls to particular endpoints. And so what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the URL, in this case, a base URL address for our HashiCorp console instance. So that's where we have the settings.json. So settings.json has been specified as part of, right here is where we grabbed or parsed the JSON payload from the plugin settings. So when you deploy the plugin and edit the plugin, there's the ability to specify the URL, in this case for the console server. We're grabbing that particular information. So we're grabbing that URL, and then we're utilizing that as part of our API call. So this is where this variable is set. So pull the settings, parse that from the JSON, and then using that notation, access that particular item. So console server URL. So where does this come from? So this specific convention or the name of the variable is the field name for our setting. And so to access this particular item, we're utilizing the field name because that's the way it's stored in the JSON payload that we're pulling back from the plugin settings. So the next thing we're doing is we're hitting the API endpoint. We're not including the trailing or the preceding slash that would typically be there on a URL. So that is automatically inserted. So there is an implicit / that would be there. And so that doesn't need to be added. And so in this case, we're specifying v1, health, and node as what we want. And so our API call to filter it just to pull back the information for this particular instance, what we need to have is the instance.name is what we're using. And so in this case, it is the lowercase name for our instance in Morpheus. If on the API endpoint side, it was in a different format. So let's say on the API endpoint, it's actually the FQDN. And so at that point, I would have to parse or grab the FQDN for this particular instance and pass that to the API call. In this particular case, the API endpoint simply expects the lowercase name of my instance. So that's something certainly to be aware of. In this case, we don't have a username or password. This is what these 2 fields would have been. That is documented in the plugin API. And then finally, we're passing information as far as headers. So the headers I'm simply passing is that the content type of JSON. So this is also a place where if there was authentication, that could be passed if it's not basic authentication, or there's a header type that's specific to the endpoint that's utilized. This is where you would pass that and then utilize the information pulled from the plugin settings. And then finally, we have whether I want to ignore SSL or not. In this case, it's false because my endpoint is not an HTTPS endpoint. I could specify that whether that's true or false, or I could turn that into a setting that is toggled as part of the plugin configuration process. And then finally, we have the method. So we've made the API call, and now what we want to do is actually parse the contents or parse the results of that API payload. So we're going to pull in a couple of aspects, a couple of code blocks that we have here. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to make a decision on if the instance doesn't have, in this case, our agent for console, or if it's not part of the system. So there's a couple of ways to deal with this. There is the decision to utilize some visibility settings that may say, you know what, I want to utilize tags within Morpheus to determine whether it should or shouldn't show, but that'll also be the mechanism by which I'll evaluate whether it's configured, or in this case has an agent or not, and is going to show up in the endpoint system. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize information from the actual request. So we're going to query or hit the console API, and then what's going to happen is if it does not return a payload, in this case, assuming that there is not an agent installed on this particular system to talk to console. So in essence, the API endpoint would effectively respond with, there's no reference to this instance. And so that's what this part is, where we specified pull back the payload. And then if there's nothing, pull back is an array. And if that array is effectively empty, what we want to do is we actually want to return a response. In this case, the response is instance not found, is the template that we want. So essentially, it's a generic catch-all that provides information about, hey, there's nothing here, this hasn't been configured yet. So that's what we want to specify. So we see a couple of things here. We see HBS, which is the handlebars reference, but we also see instance not found. So we talked about the templates, which are actually HTML templates. So the question becomes, where do those HTML templates live? And how do I specify those? So that's what we're going to walk through now. So let's bring back up our sidebar. So what we now want to do is we want to, under main, is we want to create a new folder named resources. And so as I mentioned, this is documented on the developer.morpheusdata.com site, as well as there's actually a guide that walks through custom instance types as well. So resources renderer, HBS. And so in this case, instance not found .hbs, or not found tab.hbs, excuse me. And so one of the things we'll make sure is that that maps up exactly to the name. So in this case, the reference point needs to be the exact name of our file. So one of the things we realized is that it does not include the extension. So ensure that it matches the name of the file in the resources renderer, as we see here, HBS / instance tab not found. And so what's also happening is the model object is being passed to it. Model was specified at the top right here. And so in this case, there's nothing in the model object. There's nothing that we necessarily want to pass to this particular template. And so what we want to do now is, what does that template look like? So as I mentioned, it is HTML, and you can specify CSS and JavaScript in it. So I'll pull in some text or some code snippet, so to speak. And so really what I want to do is I want to have a message that says this host is not found as part of the tab if the actual content or payload doesn't exist on the API endpoint side. So in this case, if the instance is not configured for console or doesn't have a console agent, it's going to return a generic host not found error message. It's not so much an error message, but a canned response. Could be an opportunity to ensure that the agent is installed or run various operations to actually get it to a state of where it does show that data. In this case, we're just pulling in an HTML chunk, so a div, and then in that particular case, we're specifying some various pieces of content, pulling in an icon that is the sort of the warning triangle, and then including some text for host not found, and then finally unable to find host details for this instance. One of the things we also do see here is there is some CSS as part of this particular template. And so when we get to the other template, we'll see that we can do some injection from a variable standpoint to actually see the power of the templating. So we'll go back to our code block for the provider. And so what we have here is if the instance is not found on the API endpoint side, then show the pre-can message. So that's what that block is doing. In this case, there is an else. So if the actual content does exist, or if the API returns the payload for that particular object, then there are some things that I want to do. So I'm going to pull in a pretty big chunk of code, and then we'll walk through that. So let me see if my copy and paste will work. All right, so here we go. So if the API response doesn't return information about the host, render that generic message. But in this case, if it does, what we want to do is actually parse that JSON payload that is being returned as part of the content. And so one of the things I typically do is, in this case, here's the API documentation for HashiCorp console. I reference the API documentation for whatever calls I'm making to ensure that I understand what the API response is. So in this case, let's see, we need the health information. Let's see. So I think it's on another page. Oh, here we go. So health. I want to let's see. It is actually, I think it's actually on agent overview. April maintenance metrics. All right, let's see. What was our API call? It was v1 health node. All right, so it's actually here, v1 health node. So this is the API response for what this would look like. And so as I mentioned, it is an array. And so what we want to do is we parse that array and access particular objects in that array. So in this case, we're grabbing the first object in the array, which in this case would be what's known as the surf health. So essentially the health of the node itself from a console agent standpoint is what we want to access. I could also specify to actually perform very specific validation by doing something like ensuring that the check ID was surf health. In this case, there's a bit of an assumption that that's going to be the first entry in the API response. So that's why I'm utilizing the JSON and then specifying the first element. So what I want to grab is the status. So let's check our example. So we had status, services, data center. So we want the status. In this case, we're specifying the status. And as I mentioned, we're passing it to our payload. In this case, that payload already includes the name, and now we're putting the status. So those are the first two items we see on the tab, the name and then the status. So we're going to need to grab the services, number of services, as well as the data center at some point. And then finally, this data at the bottom is what we want to grab. So we've got the status and we have the name. So what we're also going to need to grab is the data center. So the data center is not included in our initial API call. And so what we're actually going to need to do is make a subsequent API call. So we're going to make another API call as part of our tab component. So that API call, similar to the previous one, we're going to utilize our API helper. So console API, that called API. And then we're going to once again utilize the settings, that was the URL that was specified in the settings. And then finally, the endpoint that we're going to call is a little bit different. So in this case, it's v1 catalog node dash services. And then once again, we're passing the instance's name for filtering purposes. So similar to the previous call, the various settings and headers are the same. We could also do a post if there was a scenario where we needed to do a post. That's totally possible. In this case, we're utilizing 2 gets to pull back the information that we need. And so similar to what we did the last time, we're going to parse the JSON payload. So the response comes in. So from node, in this case, our variable is node services that contains the entire payload from the API response. We're going to access the content for that particular response, which in this case includes the JSON payload that was returned from the API endpoint. We're going to parse that. We're going to store that as services JSON. Then finally, I just renamed it to services, which could have been pulled out. So it could have just been services here instead of services JSON to services. All right, so now that it is services, we need to access these services. So what we'll do is we'll look at the particular API endpoint. Let's see if we can find this API endpoint. So it should be in, I believe it's catalog. All right, so we'll search for the API endpoint to see what the payload looks like. All right, so the payload that is returned looks like this for this particular instance. And so data center, it includes data center. So that's what we want. We want data center. Let's take a look at what information we need to pull back. So we want data center as well as we want the number of services. So data center is here. And then we have an array of the services. So in this case, we would just count the number of services as part of our process. And then at that point, we would have all of the information for this particular top section or header. So we'd have the name, we'd have the status, the number of services, and the data center. All right, so let's take a look at the code for that. So in this case, one of the things which like a lot of API endpoints has a little bit of nuance is that the API might return null if there are no services, or the services haven't been established, or things like where the data hasn't been seeded yet. And so what we want to do is we want to accommodate for that. And so in this case, if the services, the JSON payload returns null for services, we're effectively just going to set that to 0 statically. And so that's where we have the if statement. And then in essence, if the services is not null, then all we're going to do is we're going to effectively count the number of services in the array, and then utilize that as the payload that's passed. So we have the number of services, we have the data center, and so we have a variable services count, and then we also have services further down. So we saw that we have everything for this top section, and so now we have these 2 lower sections of metadata as well as services. And so one of the things to do is we need to grab this information. And so in this case, these are actually tables. And so we need to actually grab the array for these particular objects and utilize those to be passed to our particular template. And so what we have is services and then metadata. So if we take a look at the API response, we have services, which is an array. And then we have meta, which is actually a set of key value pairs. So slightly different from an access standpoint to get access to the data. So services, we're going to pass, and then we're going to pass the entire meta block to our template. And so once we have that information, what we're going to do is pass that to model.object. So that's what's going to be utilized to actually render the template. So the payload that we've created that includes all of our data, our data center, our services, our metadata, our services count is going to be passed into the template rendering. So we'll utilize that, be able to utilize that data to generate the dynamic HTML. So one last block we want to add. So we had a broader try statement. So one of the things of note is make sure that you have error handling for your instance tabs or all UI components of the Morpheus platform, because in the event that it does throw an error and is not handled gracefully, it will throw a 500 error on the UI component, in this particular case of instance tabs, then the user will not be able to see the actual tab not be able to see any information about the instance, because every time it looks to access it, it'll throw that error message, as opposed to being able to handle it the error gracefully, in which data may just not be presented in the instance tab, but the user will still be able to access the instance itself. So we're going to add a final catch statement. So in this case, we're just utilizing, once again, rendering of that instance not found tab as a catch-all in the event that there is some sort of error message where maybe the settings are incorrect, or the Morpheus can't hit the API endpoint, or whatever it might be. Being able to provide that catch-all is where we can still access the instance, but we're simply given or presented with an error message as part of the process. So we looked at the instance not found tab. One of the things we need to do now is we need to add the actual instance tab. So in our resources, gonna pull in a pretty large chunk of code. We'll walk through the code. So we have instance not found tab, and now we need instance tab.hbs, which maps exactly to the name that we specified as part of the reference point. So what we want to render is the instance tab. So that's why we named it instance tab.hbs. So in this case, we got a couple of items that map to what we saw in our example. So we have a header for our review. We have a sets of information. And so one of the things we see here is a variable interpolation. So name, we have status, service count, services count, and data center. So from a UI perspective, those map to these. But what we wanted to do is actually inject the data or the information. And so that's where we had, if we take a look at our payload, our console payload, which is where we put all of our information. So we specified name. So this is the variable that is going to be utilized for reference in our template. So we specified name. The value was instance.name. We specified services count, which we utilized the if-else statement to actually specify that. We specified status, and finally the data center. So that's where those references are coming from and are available since we passed that information to the model.object. So the map made those available. And so by utilizing the reference point in the map, so the name, we're simply getting the value of the name, getting the value of the status, getting the value of the services count, and then finally getting the value of the data center. And so from a templating standpoint, that's how we presented that information in to the UI component. So the next thing we wanted to do now is we need to go through this next section, which is the node metadata. So that information is pulled back via our API call. And so really all we want to do is it's a key value pair. So we just want to specify the key and then provide the value. So we have the node metadata header, and then we're utilizing a table. So this is HTML, and we're specifying the header as key and value. So it could have been anything we want to specify. And then we utilize this handlebars helper. So in essence, what we saw was that we passed multiple objects within that metadata. So the reference to the metadata variable, and then the each. So the each is as I mentioned, the special helper from a handlebars standpoint. So handlebars is a templating engine. And so in this case, the each helper allows us to iterate over each item, as its name implies, in the particular payload or object that we're passing. And so certainly ensure to utilize these particular references in terms of the pound sign or the / to essentially open and close and utilize that. So in this case, what we want to pass is the key and then the actual value. So that's what we're seeing here. So this is equal to the value of the particular item. And the key references the key. And so finally, we're closing the table component itself. And then, so now we've got this section, which we pulled back from the metadata payload that we passed. And then we also want services. So we want to only pull back a subset of the data within our services. So if we take a look at the services payload, there's a couple of items that are actually pulled back as part of the services. So things like tags and additional information that we don't necessarily want to show in the UI. And so we're going to parse that down to just exactly what it is that we want. In our example, we just want the name, the service, and the port. So similar to the metadata, we're iterating through the services object that was passed. And in this case, since it's not a key value pair, we're just simply going to access the actual data values inside. And so this dot, whatever the actual key is in the JSON payload is how we're going to parse it. So in this case, what we saw was ID, service, and then finally we wanted port is what we wanted. So it does need to match what's in the JSON payload to access it, which is why there's alignment with the ID and the service and the port to pass that information in. And then finally iterate through all of those, close the table. And then finally, we've got some small block of CSS towards the bottom here. So from a high level standpoint, we've got really all the parts and components we need from our plugin perspective to be able to inject those components in. So we've got our provider. Oh, so excuse me, there's actually one last part. So visibility. So question becomes, it's great that I can show the UI tab, but what if I want to toggle or control when and when it isn't shown? So as an example, if I were to create a plugin for some AWS or Azure or GCP information, I only want those to show up on the relevant clouds or for certain groups or for certain constructs in Morpheus to limit the scope of when and when it is not shown. And so I'm going to pull in a block for it's known as show. And so in this case, we have a couple of details that are passed to the particular object. So instance, user, and account. So I can pull back information about the instance, pull back information about the user that is accessing this particular instance, and then finally the account or tenant from which it's being accessed. And so in this case, we have a couple of options to interact with our particular workload. And so right now we're returning a show of true. So it expects either true or false. True if the user has access to it, false if the user does not have access to it. And so in this particular case, we've got some content here that we can access. So things like user permission, instance type, as well as provision type that we can utilize. So what I'll do is I will get that information. So in this case, right now, we're returning just simply true as part of the functionality. So one of the things I'll do is I'll actually reference another plugin to grab the code for, I only want to show it for situations where the user has access. All right, so it's going to load. And what I want is if the user has the appropriate RBAC permissions is really all I want. So I'm just going to steal this code block and then pop that in there. And then set this to, so I'll set to false. And I will the user permission. And so we specify the permission in our plugin. And so I'm going to grab that particular code. So console-integration is what I want. And then I want to come into the provider and specify console-integration. And so essentially all I'm doing is checking if the user has the full permission, then show the instance tab. If not, it's just going to simply return the false, which means the user cannot see the particular instance tab. All right, and then finally, the last section is referring to the get content security policy. So in this particular case, that would allow me to be able to inject some additional content, whether it's things potentially like iframes and various aspects along those lines. In this case, we don't have any additional content security policies that we need to address. So we're just simply going to return the blank or the default CSP in this particular case. This is what we're doing. So finally, we are at the point where we can generate the plugin. So I believe we've done everything. So in this particular case, I'm going to open up a terminal and run Gradle shadow jar. All right, so it's going to go through the process of downloading and compiling all the dependencies. And then it'll eventually show up in this case, my build and then libs. And then we'll see that we have the plugin that has been generated and bundled into a jar file. So at this point, I would then go into Morpheus and add the particular plugin to my Morpheus environment. And then it would start to show up. So in this case, I would do it under administration, integrations, and then I would come to plugins and I would choose the file that I wanted. So this particular case, it is plugin demo, builds, libs, and then I would click upload. Then at which point I would click on the pencil and we could see that we would specify the server URL for this particular plugin. It's that map to what we saw, the option types. And so in this case, we just specify the console URL. As I mentioned, it could be an API key or username password, which could be hidden or masked, utilizing the various different option types from a capability standpoint. And then it would be able to be utilized for reference for instances that have been configured, in this case with the console agent. I could do some additional logic from a visibility standpoint to specify, as I mentioned, for only instances that have a particular tag or part of a particular group or part of a particular cloud. I could restrict or scope that visibility there. So in this particular case, I'll show another example of a Datadog plugin. And so this would have worked just similar to our example. So I'll show how it would have looked in the case. So there is a Datadog plugin, and I created an example that will as I did a console server environment stood up. Let's see if it'll load. All right, so it finally loaded. So similar to the console plugin that we walked through, in this case, we have a plugin here. It's a little more advanced, a little fancier, but at its core, it would render similar to this. And so the console example that we walked through. And so similar to the console integration, we have the Datadog integration. It has a number of additional options. As I mentioned, you can do a number of different things: API key, application key, different scoping from a capability standpoint from the integration plugin. So let's wrap things up. So we walked through the process of creating a custom plugin from scratch. We know what that all looks like. So as we wrap up, great way to get started kicking the tires, especially in a lab or test environment with the plugins, so that you don't particularly break anything. Utilizing the Morpheus Community Edition that can be downloaded, limited to 3 clouds, 25 workloads, typically more than enough to get started with the Morpheus platform and see what's going on. Another great place that actually isn't shown here to interact and engage with the community. If there are any questions or some ideas, is discuss.morpheusdata.com. And then finally, if there's a desire for a demonstration to go a little bit deeper with the platform, certainly going to the morpheusdata.com/demo and scheduling an appointment or a meeting with one of our SCs is always an option. So definitely appreciate the time. And as I mentioned, discuss.morpheusdata.com is a great place to ask if there are any other questions.